Hi there, and welcome to Out There, an Unexplained podcast. I'm your resident mystery enthusiast, Trevor, and on the last day of each month, we come out with a new episode focused on an unexplained event or phenomena that I find interesting or just downright unexplainable. Make sure you follow the podcast on Instagram at Out There Unexplained to check out the posts I make for each episode and maybe send some suggestions you'd like to hear. Now, before we get into this episode, I have a small thing to talk about. With the new year fast approaching, there are some big announcements on the way from us here at Out There, so stay tuned in the coming weeks for that. This case, set against the icy wilderness of the Ural Mountains in Soviet Russia, has baffled investigators and spawned countless theories over 6 decades. Today, we will unravel the eerie tale of the Dyatlov Pass incident. Let's dive in. January 1959, in Sverdlovsk Oblast, a group was created for a skiing expedition into the northern Urals, put together by Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old radio engineering student at the Ural Polytechnical Institute. Dyatlov assembled a group of 9 others for the trip, most of whom were fellow students and peers at the university. The initial group consisted of 8 men and 2 women, each being an experienced Grade 2 hiker with ski tour experience, and would be receiving Grade 3 certification upon their return from their expedition. The other 9 members of the group are as follows: Yuri Doroshenko, 21, Ludmila Dubanina, 20, Yuri Krivonishenko, 23, Alexander Kulevatov, 24, Zenaida Kolmogrova, 22, Rustem Slobodin, 23, Nikolai Vladimirovich, 23, Alexander Zolotaryov, 38, and Yuri Yudin, 21. Now, here's where I need to point something out. You may be wondering, hey, so there were only 9 hikers who died, but there were 10 in the group. What happened there? So, Yuri Yudin, who had several health ailments, was with the group when they arrived in Ivdel, a town at the center of the northern province of Sverdlovsk Oblast, in the morning hours of January 25, 1959. 2 days later, they began their hike towards Gora Otorten, and the next day, Yudin decided to turn back due to knee and joint pain that made him unable to continue. The other 9 hikers continued on. With the diaries and cameras found around the area of the final campsite, it was made possible to track the group's route all the way up to the day preceding the incident. On January 31st, the group arrived at the edge of a highland area and began to prepare for climbing. They stashed surplus food and equipment that would be used for the trip back in a wooded valley close by. The next day, the hikers started to make their way through the pass. It is suggested that they planned to get over the pass and make camp for the next night on the opposite side, but due to worsening weather conditions, mainly snowstorms and decreased visibility, they lost their direction and deviated west towards the top of Kholat Syakhl. When this mistake was realized by the group, they decided to set up camp there on the slope of the mountain, rather than move 1.5 kilometers downhill to a forested area that would have offered a bit more shelter from the weather. Yudin speculated that this happened because Dyatlov probably did not want to lose their altitude they had gained, or he decided to practice camping on the mountain slope. Before leaving for the hike, Dyatlov agreed to send a telegram to their sports club as soon as they returned to the town of Vizhai after the hike. He expected this to happen no later than February 12th, but just as Yuri Yudin departed the group, Dyatlov told him that he expected it to take longer than that. February 12th came and went with no word from Dyatlov or the group. There were no immediate actions, because delays for a few days are typically common for expeditions of this size. It wasn't until February 20th that the relatives of the group members insisted a rescue operation be conducted. The head of the institute agreed, and the first rescue group was sent. This group consisted of volunteer students and teachers. The army and militia, or police forces, equipped with planes and helicopters, were later ordered to join the operation. The rescue group searched for 6 days till they finally came upon the abandoned and badly damaged tent on Kholat Syakhl. The campsite was a very baffling sight to the search party. Mikhail Sherevin, the student who found the tent, said the tent was half torn down and covered with snow. It was empty, and all the group's belongings and shoes had been left behind. After some investigation, it was said that the tent had been cut open from the inside. 9 sets of footprints, left by people in all different states of undress, some only wearing socks, a single shoe, or even barefoot, were followed down to the edge of a nearby wood on the opposite side of the pass, 1.5 kilometers to the northeast. 500 meters after this, the tracks were all covered by snow. At the edge of this forest, near a large Serbian pine, the search party found what looked to be the remains of a small fire. This is where they discovered the first 2 bodies, those of Krivoshenko and Doroshenko, who were both shoeless and dressed only in their underwear. The branches on a nearby pine were broken up to 5 meters or 16 feet high, suggesting that one of the hikers had climbed up to look for something, perhaps in an effort to relocate the camp. Between this pine and the camp, the bodies of Dyatlov, Kolmogrova, and Slobodin were all discovered. They all seemed to have died in poses suggesting that they were attempting to return to the tent. They were found at distances of 300, 480, and 630 meters from the tree respectively. It was another 2 months before any of the other bodies were discovered. The final 4 hikers were found on May 4th under 4 meters of snow in a ravine 75 meters further into the woods from the pine tree where the previous 5 were discovered. 3 of the 4 bodies were more dressed than the others, and signs showed that some clothing of those who had died first had been removed for use by others. Dubinina was wearing Krivoshenko's burned, torn trousers, and her left foot and shin were wrapped in a torn jacket. An investigation into the incident was started immediately after the first 5 bodies were found. The medical examination found no injuries that might have led to their deaths, and it was concluded that they all had died from hypothermia. Slobodin also had a small crack in his skull, but it was not thought to be a fatal wound. The examination of the last 4 bodies shifted the narrative of the incident. 3 of the hikers had fatal injuries. Vladimirovich had major skull damage, and Dubinina and Zolotaryov had major chest fractures. According to forensic expert Boris Vozhroshtheny, the force required to cause such damage would have been extreme, comparable to that of a car crash. It was also noted the bodies had no external wounds associated with the bone fractures, as if they had been subjected to high levels of pressure. All the bodies found in the ravine had soft tissue damage to their head and face, some examples being Dubinina was missing her tongue, eyes, part of the lips, as well as facial tissue and a fragment of skull bone. Zolotaryov had his eyeballs missing, and Alexander Kolovatov his eyebrows. Vozhroshtheny judged that these injuries happened post-mortem due to the location of the bodies in the ravine. Journalists reporting on the public parts of the inquest claim that it states, 6 of the group members died of hypothermia and 3 of fatal injuries. There were no indications of other people nearby on the Kolotsiakul apart from the 9 travelers. The tent had been ripped open from within. The victims had died 6 to 8 hours after their last meal. Traces from the camp showed that all group members left the campsite of their own accord, on foot. Some levels of radiation were found on one victim's clothing. There was initial speculation that the indigenous Mansi people, reindeer herders local to the area, had attacked and murdered the group for encroaching upon their lands. Several Mansi were interrogated, but the investigation indicated that the nature of the deaths did not support this hypothesis. Only the hikers' footprints were visible, and they showed no sign of hand-to-hand struggle. To dispel this theory, Vozhroshtheny stated that the fatal injuries to the 3 bodies could not have been caused by human beings because the force of the blows had been too strong and no soft tissue had been damaged. Released documents contained no information about the condition of the hikers' internal organs, and there were no survivors. Now, let's get into some of the possible explanations for what happened. At the time, the official conclusion was that the group members had died because of a compelling natural force, one of these forces being an avalanche. In 2015, the Investigative Committee of the Russian Federation, the ICRF, did a review of the original 1959 investigation by request of the families and confirmed that an avalanche could have been possible due to a few important details. First, the ICRF investigators, one of them who is an experienced alpinist, confirmed that the weather on the night of the tragedy was very harsh, with wind speeds up to hurricane force, 20 to 30 meters per second, or 45 to 67 miles per hour, and a snowstorm and temperatures reaching negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit. For some reason, these factors were not considered by the 1959 investigators who arrived at the scene of the accident 3 weeks later, when the weather had improved a lot, and any remains of the snowslide had settled and been covered with fresh snowfall. The harsh weather at the same time played a critical role in the events of the tragic night, which have been reconstructed as follows. On February 1st, the group arrives at Kolatsiakl Mountain and erects a large 9-person tent on an open slope, without any natural barriers such as forests. On the day and a few preceding days, a heavy snowfall persisted, with strong wind and frost. The group traversing the slope and digging a tent site into the snow weakened the snow base. During the night, the snowfield above the tent started to slide down slowly under the weight of the new snow, gradually pushing on the tent fabric, starting from the entrance. The group wakes up and starts evacuation in panic, with only some able to put on warm clothes. With the entrance blocked, the group escaped through a hole cut in the tent fabric and descends the slope to find a place perceived as safe from the avalanche, only 1,500 meters down at the forest border. Because some of the members have only incomplete clothing, the group splits. 2 from the group, only in their underwear and pajamas, were found at the Serbian pine tree near a fire pit. Their bodies were found first and confirmed to have died from hypothermia. 3 hikers, including Dyatlov, attempted to climb back to the tent, possibly to get sleeping bags. They had better clothes than those at the fire pit, but still quite light and with inadequate footwear. Their bodies were found at various distances, 300 to 600 meters from the campfire, in poses suggesting that they had fallen exhausted while trying to climb in deep snow in extremely cold weather. The remaining 4, equipped with warm clothing and footwear, were trying to find or build a better camping place in the forest further down the slope. Their bodies were found 70 meters from the fireplace, under several meters of snow, and with traumas indicating that they had fallen into a snow hole formed above a stream. These bodies were found only 2 months after the others. According to the ICRF investigators, the factors contributing to the tragedy were extremely bad weather and lack of experience of the group leader in such conditions, which led to the selection of a dangerous camping place. After the snowslide, another mistake of the group was to split up rather than building a temporary camp down in the forest and trying to survive throughout the night. Negligence of the 1959 investigators contributed to their report creating more questions than answers, as well as inspiring numerous alternative and conspiracy theories. On July 11, 2020, Andrei Kuryakov, deputy head of the Urals Federal District Directorate of the Prosecutor General's Office, announced an avalanche to be the official cause of death for the Dyatlov group in 1959. Later independent computer simulation and analysis by Swiss researchers also suggest avalanche as the cause. Summarizing Kuryakov's report in The New Yorker, Douglas Preston writes, "The most appealing aspect of Kuryakov's scenario is that the Dyatlov party's actions no longer seemed irrational. The snow slab, according to Green, would probably have made loud cracks and rumbles as it fell across the tent, making an avalanche seem imminent. Kuryakov noted that although the skiers made an error in the placement of their tent, everything they did subsequently was textbook. They conducted an emergency evacuation to the ground that would be safe from an avalanche. They took shelter in the woods. They started a fire. They dug a snow cave. Had they been less experienced, they may have remained near the tent, dug it out, and survived. But avalanches are by far the biggest risk in the mountains in winter, and the more experience you have, the more you fear them. The skiers' expertise doomed them. While reviewing a separate theory, American skeptic author Benjamin Radford also suggests an avalanche as more plausible. The group woke up in a panic and cut their way out of the tent, either because an avalanche had covered the entrance to their tent or because they were scared that an avalanche was imminent. It's better to have a potentially repairable slit in the tent than risk being buried alive in it under tons of snow. They were poorly clothed because they had been sleeping and ran to the safety of the nearby woods where trees would help slow incoming snow. In the darkness of night, they got separated into 2 or 3 groups. One group made a fire, hence the burned hands, while the others tried to return to the tent to recover their clothing since the danger had passed. But it was too cold, and they all froze to death before they could locate their tent in the darkness. At some point, some of the clothes may have been recovered or swapped from the dead, but at any rate, the group of 4 whose bodies were most severely damaged were caught in an avalanche and buried under 4 meters of snow, more than enough to account for the compelling natural force the medical examiner described. Dubinina's tongue was most likely removed by scavengers in ordinary predation. Even though an avalanche is the top theory, there are a few pieces of contradictory evidence for this theory at the time, such as the location of the incident did not have any obvious signs of an avalanche having taken place. An avalanche would have left certain patterns and debris distributed over a wide area. The bodies found within a month of the event were covered with a very shallow layer of snow, and had there been an avalanche of sufficient strength to sweep away the second party, these bodies would have been swept away as well. This would have caused more serious and different injuries in the process and would have damaged the tree line. Over 100 expeditions to the region had been held since the incident, and none of them ever reported conditions that might create an avalanche. A study of the area using up-to-date terrain-related physics revealed that the location was entirely unlikely for such an avalanche to have occurred. The dangerous conditions found in another nearby area, which had significantly steeper slopes and cornices, were observed in April and May when the snowfalls of winter were melting. During February, when the incident occurred, there were no such conditions. An analysis of the terrain and the slope showed that even if there could have been a very specific avalanche that found its way into the area, its path would have gone past the tent. The tent had collapsed from the side, but not in a horizontal direction. Dyatlov was an experienced skier, and the much older Zolotaryov was studying for his master's certificate in ski instruction and mountain hiking. Neither of these 2 men would have been likely to camp anywhere in the path of a potential avalanche. And footprint patterns leading away from the tent were inconsistent with someone, let alone a group of 9 people, running in panic from either real or imagined danger. All the footprints leading away from the tent and towards the woods were consistent with individuals who were walking at a normal pace. Let's move on to another possible theory, this being something called katabatic wind. A Swedish-Russian expedition was made to the site in 2019, and after these investigations, they proposed that a violent katabatic wind was a possible explanation for the incident. For those not familiar, katabatic winds are essentially winds that float downhill. They are usually caused by gravity pulling higher density air downslope to lower density air. These winds originate from the difference of density of 2 air masses located above a slope. This density difference usually comes from temperature difference, even if humidity may also play a role. Schematically, katabatic winds can be divided into 2 types, for which the mechanisms are slightly different. The katabatic winds, due to radiative cooling, these are also the most common, and then fall winds. In the first case, the slope surface cools down radiatively after sunset, which cools down the air near the slope. This cooler air layer then flows down into the valley. This type of katabatic wind is very often observed during the night in the mountains. In contrast, fall winds do not come from radiative cooling of the air, but rather from the advection of a relatively cold air mass to the top of a slope. This cold air mass can come from the arrival of a cold front, or from the advection of cool marine air by a sea breeze. They are also somewhat rare and can be very violent. They were implied to be the case of an incident in 1978 at Inaris Mountain in Sweden, where 8 hikers were killed and 1 severely injured. The topography of these locations were noted to be very similar, according to the expedition. A sudden katabatic wind would have made it impossible to remain in the tent, and the most rational course of action would have been for the hikers to cover the tent with snow and seek shelter behind the tree line. On top of the tent, there was also a flashlight left turned on, possibly left there intentionally, so that the hikers could find their way back to the tent once the wind subsided. The expedition proposed that the group of hikers constructed 2 bivouac shelters, one of which collapsed, leaving 4 of the hikers buried with the severe injuries observed. Another theory that is on the more scientific side is what is referred to as infrasound. Infrasound, or also referred to as low-frequency sound or subsonic, describes sound waves with a frequency below the lower limit of human audibility, generally 20 Hz, as defined by the American National Standards Institute. Hearing becomes gradually less sensitive as frequencies decrease, so for humans to perceive infrasound, the sound pressure must be sufficiently high. A fairly popular example of infrasound is the mysterious brown note. This is a hypothetical infrasonic frequency capable of causing fecal incontinence by creating acoustic resonance in the human bowel. If you want to learn more about this, I would recommend watching Mythbusters Season 3, Episode 12, where Adam and Jamie test the effects of infrasound on the human body by exploring this supposed brown note. This infrasound theory was popularized by Donnie Icar in his 2013 book Dead Mountain, in which he stated that the wind going around Kolotsiakl created a Karaman vortex street, which is a repeating pattern of swirling vortices caused by a process known as vortex shedding, which is responsible for the unsteady separation of a flow of fluid around the blunt bodies, which can produce infrasound capable of inducing panic attacks in humans. According to Icar's theory, the infrasound generated by the wind as it passed over the top of the Kolotsiakl mountain was responsible for causing physical discomfort and mental distress in the hikers. Icar claimed that, because of their panic, the hikers were driven to leave the tent by whatever means necessary and fled down the slope. By the time they were further down the hill, they would have been out of the infrasound's path and would have regained their composure, but in the darkness would have been unable to return to their shelter. The traumatic injuries suffered by 3 of the victims were the result of their stumbling over the edge of a ravine in the darkness and landing on the rocks at the bottom. One of the last theories is that the campsite fell within the path of a Soviet parachute mine exercise. This theory states that the hikers, woken by loud explosions, fled the tent in a shoeless panic and found themselves unable to return for supply retrieval. After some members froze to death attempting to endure the bombardment, others commandeered their clothing, only to be fatally injured by subsequent parachute mine concussions. These parachute mines detonate while still in the air rather than upon striking the Earth's surface, and produce signature injuries similar to those experienced by the hikers. Heavy internal damage with relatively little external damage. This theory coincides with reported sightings of glowing orange orbs floating or falling in the sky within the general vicinity of the hikers, and they were allegedly photographed by them. Now, there are indeed records of parachute mines being tested by the Soviet military in the area around the time the hikers were there, so it's quite possible that they got stuck in the middle of a run. This theory, along with many others, also uses scavenging animals to explain Dubinina's injuries. A similar theory alleges that instead of a parachute mine exercise, the group walked in on a radiological weapon test site. This is based partially on the fact that there was radioactivity found on some of the clothing, as well as the descriptions of the bodies by relatives as having orange skin and gray hair. However, radioactive dispersal would have affected all, not just some, of the hikers and equipment, and the skin and hair discoloration can also be explained by a natural process of mummification after 3 months of exposure to the cold and wind. The initial suppression of the files describing the group's disappearance by Soviet authorities is sometimes mentioned as evidence of a cover-up. But the concealment of information about domestic incidents was standard procedure in the USSR at the time, and thus isn't very peculiar. But by the late 1980s, all Dyatlov files had been released to the public in some manner. Now, all of these theories are very plausible, but the one I think is actually the reasoning for it is infrasound. It is such an interesting phenomenon, and the effects of it on the human body are not fully understood, but the effects that are known do line up pretty well with what happened to the hikers, and I personally see it as a very fitting answer to this infamous unsolved mystery. These theories really show how brutal Mother Nature is and how dangerous places like this can be if you aren't fully prepared to face them. And as you ponder the reasoning for this ill-fated adventure, I want you to remember, in the ever-expanding and tangled web of life, there are a lot of unknowns. It makes you think, will we someday find out what is really out there? We are on Instagram, @OutThereUnexplained, so make sure to follow us and tell us all of your thoughts on the cases we cover and what you'd like to hear next. Also, while you are there, check out the link tree in our bio to check out all the other forms of social media we have, such as the new Discord server, and any other things we have going on there. Make sure to rate us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts and leave us a review. It's a great way for others to find the podcast and enjoy, just like you. Head over to our Instagram and let the clues be your guide to find out where the web of the unknown will take us next. This episode was written and hosted by me, Trevor, with logo design by Jason Zykes and theme music from purpleplanet.com.